I was 38 years old, and by December in Charlotte, the air always carried a damp chill that slipped through coats, no matter how heavy they were. I had lived long enough in this city to know the rhythms of its seasons, the way the lights along Tryon Street came alive before Thanksgiving, and the holiday music spilled from every store. I also knew the rhythm of my own life, one that for the last 10 years had been ruled by automatic payments and late-night logins, making sure nothing in my family's world ever flickered or failed. My name was on the mortgage for my parents' house, on the utility accounts that kept their lights on, and on the credit cards they used when they wanted to appear generous at church luncheons or charity events. Every month I watched the withdrawals march across my bank statements like clockwork. 600 here for the electric company, 1,000 for the gas and water bundle, over 2,000 for the mortgage, and countless small charges that belonged more to my siblings' lives than to mine. I had been doing this for so long that I barely questioned it anymore. It was my version of loyalty, or maybe it was simply habit, and everyone in my family had learned to treat it as if it was the natural order. My father Charles had retired a decade earlier and liked to tell anyone who would listen that he once ran a construction company. He repeated the same stories about contracts he won in the 90s, about buildings that still stood with his mark on them. What he never repeated was the part where the company went under, or the part where I had stepped in to keep their house from slipping into foreclosure after his mistakes piled up. My mother Evelyn wore her public face so carefully it was hard to remember what she looked like without it. She sat on boards for local charities, posted photos at black tie galas, and spoke in the voice of a woman who had built a legacy. Rebecca, my younger sister, worked in public relations and curated her life online like it was a magazine spread. She carried handbags I knew she could not afford on her salary, and smiled wide in restaurants I had unknowingly paid for through the accounts in my name. Daniel, my youngest brother, had landed a position at a regional bank, but was always one slip away from trouble, leaning on me when fees piled up or when he forgot to make payments. In the first week of December, I sat at my dining table in my apartment uptown, the glow of the laptop the only light in the room. An email had arrived from my mother with the subject line, "Holiday Seating List." I clicked it with the kind of reflex I had built over years, already expecting to see what time I needed to be there, which cousin was bringing what dish, and who had been placed at which table. What I saw instead made me lean back in my chair, my pulse rising even as the screen stayed steady. 30 names filled the page, aunts and uncles, neighbors and church friends, even a few people I had not seen in years. I scrolled down twice, my eyes catching on every detail, but there was no mistake. My name was not there. I stared at the screen so long the light began to blur. At first I thought perhaps it was an oversight, that maybe another email would follow with corrections. Then my phone buzzed a message from my mother. "We all agreed you don't need to attend this year. Don't make this bigger than it is." The words landed harder than any fight we had ever had. I read them once, twice, 3 times. They were careful, clipped like everything Evelyn ever said when she wanted to close a conversation before it began. My hands trembled slightly as I set the phone down on the table. In that moment, the years of bills I had paid, the nights I had stayed up to make sure the mortgage cleared, the countless small rescues I had offered to every member of that household, all of it collapsed into a hollow silence. I pushed away from the table and walked to the window. Outside, the city lights glowed in steady patterns, office towers still humming with late workers, couples holding hands on sidewalks, laughter carrying from bars. To everyone else, it was the season of warmth and togetherness. To me, it was the moment I realized that in the eyes of my family, I was not even worth a place at their table. I picked up the phone again, scrolled back to the message, and for the first time, allowed myself to feel the weight of what had always been true. They had never really seen me, not when I was a girl earning straight A's, not when I was a woman climbing the corporate ladder, and certainly not in the years I kept their world spinning with my money. That night, sitting alone with the glow of the screen fading into darkness, I understood that they had not only erased my name from a seating chart, they had erased me from their idea of family. I closed the laptop slowly, my reflection faint against the black screen. My chest tightened, not with rage, but with clarity. The cold outside pressed against the glass, and for once, I did not move to turn up the heat. The silence in my apartment felt heavier than ever, but inside that silence, something new was stirring. I thought back to all the times I had stepped in quietly, moments no one else ever seemed to remember, but that had shaped the way I carried their burdens. In 2015, my mother stood in the checkout line at a Harris Teeter grocery store, her cart full of wine bottles and imported cheese for a church fundraiser. I watched from a few feet away as her credit card was declined, the cashier growing impatient, while a couple in line sighed loudly behind her. Before the shame could land, I slipped my card into the machine, smiled at the cashier as if nothing was wrong, and told my mother not to worry. She never spoke of it again, not even a thank you, but she held her head high when she walked out of the store, and that seemed to be all that mattered. In 2017, Rebecca decided she needed a birthday celebration at a rooftop bar in downtown Charlotte. The DJ demanded a last-minute payment. The catering company held back deliveries until they saw cash in hand, and the bill ballooned higher than anyone expected. Rebecca called me in a panic close to midnight, her voice thick with champagne, saying the party would collapse without another few $1,000s. I wired the money from my phone while sitting on my couch in pajamas, listening to her laughter resume on the other end once the transfer cleared. The next morning she posted photos of her perfect night, tagged every guest, and never once mentioned me. In 2019, Daniel forgot to pay his credit card for months and was hit with fees that nearly matched his entire paycheck. He showed up at my apartment pale and nervous, asking if there was any way I could fix it. I called the bank, directly spoke to a manager, and negotiated the reversal of every penalty while Daniel sat across from me staring at his shoes. He left relieved, promising to be more careful, and within weeks he bought himself new golf clubs instead of saving a dime. Each of these incidents was a small stone on my shoulders, never acknowledged, never lifted off. My father Charles once told me in a calm, almost dismissive voice, "You are strong, we never have to worry about you." He meant it as praise, but it was a verdict. It gave everyone permission to look away while piling more weight on my back. Rebecca received gifts of jewelry and trips, Daniel received forgiveness and second chances, and I received a nod in passing, as if that was enough to keep me going. Now it was December again, and I sat at my dining table with my laptop open to my banking app. Rows of scheduled payments stared back at me, more than 40 charges lined up for the month. Duke Energy, Piedmont Natural Gas, Charlotte Water, the mortgage lender, the cable company, and countless recurring charges for cards that bought dinners, clothes, and trips that were never mine. The total for December alone was just under $7,000, a number so large it pressed against my chest. My own rent, my own groceries, my own life were secondary in that sea of red. I rested my finger on the trackpad, hovering over the button that could cancel or freeze those transactions. It was almost absurd how much power sat there, how years of silent sacrifice could be unraveled by one click. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I could hear my mother's voice telling me not to make things dramatic, my father insisting I was strong enough to handle it, Rebecca laughing into her phone, Daniel promising he would pay me back one day. The sound of all their voices blended into a noise I had lived with for a decade, and for the first time I wanted silence. I closed the laptop slowly and leaned back in my chair. Outside, the city moved on, cars humming down South Boulevard, the faint echo of holiday music spilling from a bar. Inside my apartment, the only sound was my own breathing. For the first time, the possibility of ending the pattern no longer felt like fantasy. It felt like a decision waiting for me to claim it. What I did not know yet was that a single piece of paper hidden in my parents' files would soon make that decision even clearer and far more dangerous. One night, I pulled out the mortgage folder from the fireproof box in my closet, intending only to check on payment history. The papers smelled faintly of dust and ink, layers of signatures and notarized stamps that had shaped the last decade of my life. As I flipped through the stack, my eyes froze on a quitclaim deed dated 2016. My name was written clearly beside my mother's, marked as co-owner. Her signature curled across the bottom in blue ink, and the notary seal still pressed faintly into the page. I remembered that afternoon, the lawyer's office in uptown Charlotte, the way my mother had smiled tightly as we both signed. She had told me it was a formality, a way to make sure I was protected if anything ever happened to them. But tucked further back was another version dated 2022. The handwriting was colder, the formatting newer, and my name had vanished. The house was listed under Rebecca's sole ownership, transferred by Evelyn. I held the two deeds side by side, the truth glaring at me like headlights on a dark road. My father Charles had never been detail-oriented, and in his older age he barely skimmed documents. It was not negligence from him, it was calculation from Evelyn and Rebecca. They had rewritten the legacy, while I was still paying every cent that kept it standing. I stuffed the papers back into the folder and drove the next morning to see Patricia Owens, the attorney who had once drafted my prenuptial agreement. Her office was quiet, lined with books that smelled of leather and paper. She adjusted her glasses as I slid the two deeds across her desk. She studied them silently for a moment before tapping her pen on the table. If your name is on the earlier deed, you retain rights. You could file a lis pendens immediately. It would freeze any sale or transfer. I stared at her, my hands trembling slightly. So I am not crazy. They really tried to erase me. Patricia's gaze softened. Families can be cruel in ways strangers never dare. But the law is on your side. I walked back to my car, clutching the folder, the winter air sharp against my skin. Inside the documents lay the confirmation I had always feared. It was not enough for them to push me out of Christmas dinners or family photos. They wanted me erased from the very roof I had been paying for. My mother's elegant parties, Rebecca's posts about the house's charm, Daniel's claims of home, all of it rested on the mortgage tied to my account. And yet on paper, they had chosen to pretend I did not exist. That night, I laid the deed on my dining table and turned on a single lamp. I traced the ink of my mother's signature, the one that had once acknowledged me, then the later one that erased me. Betrayal and clarity surged together in my chest, bitter and electric. They had left a weapon in my hands, signed and sealed. I did not sleep much. My mind circled around every bill I had ever paid, every holiday, where I brought food or gifts, every time I heard my father tell people Rebecca would inherit the house as if it were natural. Now I knew it was not just talk. It was a plot already written into law. The next morning, I placed the deed in a clear folder, slid it into my work bag, and carried it with me like a hidden blade. I had evidence now, and evidence meant power. The decision I had been circling in silence was no longer a question of courage. It was a question of timing. I had no idea yet that the timing would arrive sooner than I imagined, on a night when the Mitchell family would gather under glittering lights, convinced the world still believed their performance. I called Helena the next morning, my voice low but steady, as I asked if she could come over. She arrived with her laptop bag slung over her shoulder, her dark hair pulled into a ponytail, the kind of friend who never asked too many questions until I was ready to speak. I spread the documents across my dining table, the old deed, the new deed, and months of bank statements with my name stamped at the top. She studied the pile, her eyebrows knitting together as she realized what she was looking at. "You have been carrying them for years," she said quietly, "and they pretended it was all theirs." Together we began to build a digital case. Helena connected her laptop to mine and helped me organize every file into a secure folder we named Evidence Frozen Accounts. She pulled down copies of utility contracts that showed me as the only customer of record. She downloaded archived social media posts of Rebecca's elaborate dinners and luxury trips, each one tagged with captions about success, but in reality funded through the accounts in my name. She even captured Evelyn's live streams from charity events, where she stood on stages thanking donors, smiling under chandeliers paid for by checks that had cleared from my account. While Helena handled the technical side, I reached for the phone and called Patricia. The calm in her voice steadied me as I explained what I had uncovered and what I planned to do. She did not sound surprised. "If the accounts are in your name," she said, "you have every right to freeze them. It is lawful, clean, and it forces them to face what they have taken for granted." Her words felt like a door opening. That evening I sat alone in my apartment with my laptop balanced on my knees. The glow of the screen lit the room as I logged into the online banking system. Rows of accounts lined the dashboard, each one tied to a service my family relied on. Mortgage, utilities, credit cards, the auto-pay settings all linked back to me. My pulse quickened as I hovered over the first account. The button labeled Freeze Account blinked like an invitation. I hesitated, my hand trembling slightly. Memories flooded me. My mother's voice dismissing me at Christmas, my father praising Rebecca for achievements she had never earned. Daniel joking about how lucky he was that late fees disappeared. Rebecca laughing into her phone as if money was endless. My chest tightened, and then I clicked. A message appeared. Account frozen. Success. The words glowed against the screen, simple and final. A strange calm swept through me. For 10 years I had been invisible, reduced to a walking wallet, dismissed as strong enough to never need recognition. With one click, I felt the weight shift. I was no longer only their provider. I had become the one holding the ground beneath their feet. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen, as the implications settled in. This was only a beginning, a single move in a game that had been played behind my back for too long. My finger hovered over the next account and the next, knowing that with every click the glittering world they flaunted would start to crack. The sound of Helena's voice echoed in my head from earlier. Families can be cruel in ways strangers never dare. She had been right. And now, with evidence neatly organized and power returned to my hands, I finally understood that cruelty could be answered without a word spoken. I closed the laptop and let the silence stretch around me. Outside, the city lights flickered across the skyline, steady and bright. Inside, my apartment hummed with the quiet of a plan forming a plan that would not wait much longer. What I did not know yet was how spectacularly that plan would collide with the Mitchell family's perfect Christmas Eve. On Christmas Eve, the Mitchell estate gleamed like a stage set for a Broadway premiere. White lights draped across the roofline, wreaths shimmered on every window, and valets hurried to park cars as if it were a gala in uptown Charlotte. I watched the live stream Helena had pulled for me, the images sharp and cruelly beautiful on my laptop screen. Guests in black tie gowns swept through the front doors, their laughter spilling out into the cold night. Rebecca stood at the center sequence, flashing under the lights, her phone angled high as she broadcast the perfect Mitchell holiday to thousands of strangers. Inside the ballroom, chandeliers showered the crowd in golden light. Evelyn held court at the microphone, pearls gleaming against her silver dress, her voice carrying over the murmur of the guests. She spoke of family values, of sacrifice, of the Mitchell name, as if it were carved into the foundation of the city itself. Behind her, Charles lifted his bourbon glass with a grin too wide, reliving business victories that belonged to decades past. Daniel lingered at the edge of the frame, laughing too loudly, eager to be noticed, but never questioned. I sat on my couch only a few miles away, the glow of the screen flickering against the ornaments of my small tree. My chest rose and fell in a rhythm I could not steady. For 10 years I had carried them quietly. Tonight the weight was shifting back into their hands. Helena texted me a capture of Rebecca's live stream, Rebecca leaning into the camera, champagne in hand, hashtags tumbling across the screen. Beneath it, Helena wrote simply, "They really believe this." I typed one word back, "Wait." On the screen, a champagne tower glittered under the lights, sparklers flaring as guests clapped and filmed with their phones. Rebecca shouted into her camera, her face flushed with triumph, feeding on the validation of comments and hearts flying across the feed. Evelyn returned to the microphone, thanking donors for their generosity, her smile unyielding, her tone polished like glass. The crowd applauded again, unaware that their applause was built on the back of my silence. I reached for my phone on the coffee table. A message sat at the top of the screen from the utility company. Remote disconnect confirmed. My fingers lingered over the glass, and I closed my hand around it, as if I were holding the very lever that kept their world glowing. I leaned forward, eyes locked on the feed. The chandeliers shimmered, the quartet struck another note, and the Mitchell family basked in the admiration of their guests. They had crafted an illusion so flawless it almost convinced me again. Almost. I sat straighter, my pulse quiet but strong. In seconds, the lights that crowned their perfect world would falter, and when they did, no speech, no toast, no camera filter would be able to save them. The chandeliers flickered once, and then the entire house plunged into darkness. Gasps rippled through the ballroom, followed by uneasy laughter, the kind people use when they are not sure whether to be amused or afraid. The quartet fell silent, their bows hovering above strings, and the guests murmured as the golden glow that had crowned the Mitchells vanished in an instant. On my screen, the picture blurred as Rebecca's phone shifted wildly. Her voice cracked as she tried to keep her audience calm. "Hold on, everyone, just a little glitch." But the comments flooded with confusion, the hearts replaced with question marks and jeers. Behind her, children cried, their voices carrying over the feed as adults fumbled for candles and flashlights. Evelyn's voice rose above the noise, sharp and commanding. "Stay calm, we will handle this." She pulled her phone from her clutch, dialing quickly, her pearl bracelet clinking in the dark. The operator's voice must have told her what I already knew. "Service account holder Lauren Mitchell. Immediate disconnect processed." Evelyn's face tightened, and she pressed her card against the screen to order emergency service. The machine beeped, then rejected the transaction. Declined. Rebecca tried to order champagne from a server eager to salvage her stream. The waiter returned quietly, whispering something that made her cheeks burn red in the glow of a single candle. Payment could not be processed. She turned the phone away from her face, ending the stream abruptly. The silence that followed was louder than any applause she had ever sought. Charles stood near the head table, turning slowly in the dim light, his glass of bourbon forgotten in his hand. He looked at the guests, then at Evelyn, but no explanation came. His bluster dissolved into confusion, his shoulders sagging as whispers spread like wildfire. For a man who built his identity on strength and stability, the sight of him powerless was almost unreal. Daniel's face appeared briefly in the feed as he checked his phone, his expression shifting from curiosity to horror. An email glowed against the dark. "Investigation notice. Report to office December 26th. His jaw slackened as he read it again, then locked his screen and shoved the phone into his pocket, but not before those nearest had seen the panic in his eyes. The ballroom shimmered faintly now, only from candles pulled hastily from drawers. Shadows leapt across the walls, turning the grandeur of the evening into something almost medieval. Conversations broke into sharp whispers. Some guests excused themselves early, claiming early mornings or sudden headaches. Others stayed, their curiosity stronger than their discomfort, watching the Mitchells flounder at the center of their own spectacle. I sat in my apartment with the laptop glowing faintly on the table, my own reflection caught against the darkened screen. I could almost smell the expensive perfume, the sweet smoke of sparklers, the cloying scent of champagne now turning sour. I had not raised my voice, not stormed into their house, not demanded acknowledgement. I had simply withdrawn what had been mine all along, and the absence roared louder than any speech. The camera caught Evelyn again, her hand gripping the microphone, though no sound system carried her words now. She tried to assure the crowd it was temporary, just a small technical error, but the tone betrayed her. Rebecca sat frozen, her phone face down on the table. Charles remained still, staring into the candlelight, as if trying to summon a plan that would not come. I closed my laptop slowly, the quiet in my apartment wrapping around me like a cloak. In that silence, I realized this was only the beginning. The lights were out, the cards declined, the facade cracked, but the deeper reckoning had not yet arrived. The Mitchell name would not survive what was waiting just beyond Christmas morning. Christmas morning broke cold and gray, the kind of light that makes even the most decorated houses look tired. I sat at my kitchen table with a mug of coffee, scrolling through headlines on my phone. The Charlotte Observer had already published a story. Evelyn Mitchell steps down from charity board, pending review of financial inconsistencies. Her smiling face from the night before was frozen at the top of the article, but the text underneath stripped the smile of any meaning. Words like irregularities, donor concern, and investigation turned her reputation into ash. I refreshed my feed and found more. Neighborhood forums buzzing with posts from guests who had been at the party. One described the blackout as eerie. Another admitted they had never seen Evelyn so rattled. A few hinted at whispers about unpaid bills, about appearances that no longer matched reality. The carefully crafted image of the Mitchells was unraveling thread by thread, and for once, it was not me holding it together. Later that afternoon, I drove past Sharon Road. The house stood dark, a wreath still hanging lopsided on the front door. On the gate, a paper notice fluttered in the wind. Notice of default. Payment past due. Foreclosure process may begin January 2025. I parked across the street watching as a couple walking their dog slowed to read it, whispering to each other before moving on. The Mitchell name was no longer a shield. It was gossip on the sidewalk. Meanwhile, Rebecca's empire of curated perfection collapsed silently. Her Instagram page, once filled with brand collaborations and lavish posts, was stripped bare. Without the auto-pay cards in my name, her contracts froze. Messages from sponsors leaked announcing partnership terminations. The comments shifted from admiration to mockery, her followers demanding explanations she could not give. The silence from her was louder than her constant streaming had ever been. Charles felt the blow in his own circle. Old business contacts stopped returning his calls, a golfing buddy canceled their trip, and a longtime friend withdrew an invitation to a fundraiser. Without lights, without bourbon to mask his fading presence, he was simply a man with no leverage left. And Daniel. News traveled fast in the banking world. His compliance notice had turned into an official administrative leave. Emails to his account bounced back with automated replies. Coworkers whispered about questionable transactions, about conflict of interest. He who once bragged that his job was secure now faced the reality that nothing about his position was untouchable. That evening, I opened the drawer in my apartment and pulled out the folder that held the original deed. My fingers traced the embossed notary seal, the one with Evelyn's signature still curling at the bottom. It was proof more damning than any gossip that at one time I had been recognized and then erased. Holding it now, I felt the truth settle deeper. They had not just betrayed me at Christmas. They had planned to cut me from the very bones of the family legacy. The papers glowed under the lamplight as if they carried their own fire. I slid them back into the folder, my breath slow but unshaken. Outside, the city hummed with holiday quiet. Inside, I felt the storm still building. The blackout and the headlines were only the surface. The deeper reckoning, the one tied to every dollar and every signature, was still waiting for its turn. That night, the city outside my window was hushed, the streets nearly empty, the kind of quiet that follows a storm. I curled into the corner of my couch, a blanket draped over my shoulders, the soft glow of my Christmas tree lights flickering across the room. My phone buzzed on the table screen, lighting up with call after call. Mother, then Rebecca, then Daniel. Missed call, voicemail, missed call again. I let them pile up like snow against a door I had no intention of opening. For years, I had been the one they reached for, when something broke, when bills stacked up, when consequences came due. My number was the lifeline that held their world together. Tonight, that chain was cut. I poured myself a glass of red wine, the sound rich and steady, and lifted it slowly to my lips. The silence tasted sweeter than any praise I had ever begged from them. I thought about Charles, my father, and the look he must have worn that morning when he realized none of his old friends wanted to take his calls. I imagined Evelyn staring at her reflection as headlines replaced applause, her pearls suddenly heavier than she could carry. I pictured Rebecca scrolling through her empty accounts, brand partners, disappearing one by one, her perfect feed crumbling into irrelevance. And Daniel clutching his phone with the letter from HR that stripped him of the pride he flaunted at family dinners. The wine warmed my chest as memories unspooled. 10 years of grocery store rescues, midnight transfers, and quiet forgiveness. 10 years of being told I was strong enough to go without, that my place was outside the spotlight, that my role was to pay silently while they performed. My breath caught as I realized how easily I had let them write me out, how willingly I had believed being invisible was safer than demanding to be seen. The folder with the original deed sat on my coffee table, a silent witness to what they had tried to erase. I slid it closer, ran my hand across the crisp edges, and whispered the truth to myself. They had erased me from their table. I had only returned the favor by erasing their access to what they never deserved. The wind rattled faintly against the window, carrying with it the last sounds of Christmas night. I tipped the glass again, the liquid dark and smooth, and let a laugh escape my throat. It was not cruel, not triumphant, just free. The kind of laugh that comes when the weight you carried no longer belongs to you. My phone lit up again, another desperate call from Evelyn, then Rebecca, then silence. I set it face down and leaned back, the tree lights reflecting in the wine glass. I spoke into the room, my voice calm and final. They erased me from family. I erased the family from my sacrifices. The clock ticked softly on the wall, the apartment wrapped in its own kind of peace. Tomorrow would bring more fallout, more headlines, more whispers across Charlotte. But tonight belonged to me, to the quiet I had earned. And now, I leave you with this. If you were in my place, carrying the weight of a family that refused to see you, would you have had the courage to freeze it all and watch the mask fall away? Tell me what you would have done, because sometimes the silence we choose can speak louder than every word they ever denied us.